Thank you very much. It is an absolute privilege to be here. And they warned me that you would be able to take challenging concepts and creative turbulence. They said they can take it. So that's where I went. But as I say, it really is very, very important and a huge honour to talk to you. And also here, I won't go into too much detail, but when you read my book, the outside of this building has huge spiritual importance to me and is a reminder of the emergencies and the disasters that we face in the UK. The other thing about talking about disaster and emergencies and crisis and catastrophes and peril is that people can feel that we rattle the fates. I often find that the private sector are much more comfortable with me around saying emergencies. We do a lot of touching of the wood. We're talking about, superstition here. But actually, it's incredibly important now that we find the coherent narrative to talk about the way forward in darker times. And one of the most important things that you can do for your organisation is find ways to talk about this. So the aim today is a few key points and then a couple of questions and answers. And the way that I've scoped it is with a broad view that there are charities and charitable foundations and trusts here, and hopefully all of it will be useful. The other thing, as many people say who've attended my talks, is it can be a bit like being hit by a Mack truck. So in order for your own welfare needs to be met, there are resources. There's obviously When the Dust Settles. Please do grab yourself a copy and then one for your family, friends and trustees. But also there's a wonderful blog that the association have put out. Also I'll make reference to some podcasts. We've all got what's called clinically at the moment Pandy Brain. Normally we would call it Disaster Brain. And it's the fact that you consume information differently at the moment. Somebody sends you a PDF, your heart sinks. So there's something quite nice about putting some of this information into little podcasts. And I've put all of those on a website, whatevernext.info. So when I say, ooh, think about this, or ooh, think about that, hopefully there's a talk that I've given somewhere about that. Caring, as we find most people in the charitable sector do, makes you more vulnerable, not less, to burnout and exhaustion. So one of the things that I'm really passionate about within those resources is there's several about your own needs, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. I also tweet regularly at Lucy Gobag, but what I would do is I would follow me, then immediately mute me, set your notifications to not go off, and then bury your phone in a what you call a Faraday bag that can't receive signal in the garden, because I tweet relentlessly and through the night. And at the moment, there is a real sense that this is probably our last week on that platform, so I'm getting everything I can out of it. I am an emergency planner. There's a lot of us. You'll find us all over the place, in the charitable sector, in the bigger charities often, in the private sector, in the public sector, and we make big, long lists of all the things that will befall us. We write plans, which are basically checklists, and we respond when needed. We do the things afterwards, then we have lessons learned events, then we go again. And people say, where do you go to special disaster planning school? We do have a degree programs, we do have courses, but very simply, being a disaster planner is very similar to organising a conference. So big up to the ACF team. There is a lot of, will we have enough tea and coffee? Why is the queue at the cloakroom so big? And so there's a lot of challenge around logistics, essentially, in disaster planning. Where I've tended to find my niche is in the aftermath, mainly because I rock up and nobody minds if I break the printer, because they've got bigger considerations. But I'm in the rebuild. I also do a lot of work in the bereavement, the care of the survivors, and where I particularly go in the book is the care of the deceased. And that's really important to me as well. And one of the things about the book is that I've been able to marry the work that I do in preparedness with the work that I do in the initial, absolutely devastating response, and then link that all the way through to a rebuild. And one of the editorial decisions I made with the book is you will know where I have been and what I have seen to make sense of why a horizon is so important to me, why a rebuild is so important to me. In the early stages of the pandemic, we weren't really allowed to use the D word, disaster. Other countries have disaster. We have a level 4 crisis with a slight sprinkling of peril. And what I argued, and I argued with government ministers on, was let me use the D word, because then we can use our resources. We know a lot about post-disaster life. We know a lot about giving and charitable action post-disaster. We know what works. There haven't been many surprises if you are a disaster planner in the last 3 years. It's quite an unusual experience, I think, compared to many others. All of our existing disaster knowledge on how society feels, where things go, has been equally applicable. People work very hard to try and exceptionalize the event that they're going through. But in fact, what we do in disaster planning is called isomorphic learning. We squeeze the juices out of every possible case study and apply it to others. We knew, for example, we would see more charities, more grassroots charities. We would see all of the same issues. We would see charities either withering on the vine or thriving as they became clearer on their purpose. And we knew the kind of things that charities need very much, as what was just said, beyond money. They may need a lease, a meeting room, space for an archive, and administrative support. These were things 100 years of disaster response had taught us. We worried a lot about something that you'll see in your resource pack called the honeymoon phase, which is, again, 70 years of Red Cross research on how the initial 8 to 12 weeks of a disaster can feel quite heroic and giving, but quickly drops off, and there's not really much you can do about that. It's not your fault. So one of the things we urge charities to do is to measure their plans against both the recovery graph and also a graph drawn up by the Relationships Project on the pandemic-specific recovery graph, the ebbs and flows, to think seasonally where people's heads are at, to think about what happens when goodwill fades, to avoid possibly the hero and the villain narrative. There's a little clip just put on YouTube this morning of me being quite critical of the clap. That's the clapping for carers, no other meaning intended. Because it was buying into a hero narrative and the honeymoon phase. And we knew that in disaster recovery literature, heroes become villains in the story arc. You're looking for a sweet spot somewhere else. I've mentioned that carers, people who care, people who are empathetic, people who are sympathetic, tend to suffer most from things like emotional and compassionate burnout. And so some of the resources, as I say, really look after you. And the most important people in your organisation are your workforce. There's no differentiation between paid staff and volunteers and trustees. They are all your concern. And when I work in disaster, I see staff go through very difficult things. I was very struck by thinking what it must be like to run the Money Advice Trust when the calls start to become a completely different type of call, a completely different type of need. I'm working with some banks at the moment where people are saying on the phone, either you do this or I will kill myself. I'm ready to kill myself now. What are you going to do about it? This is a different type of trauma on your staff than we have seen before. One of the end notes in the book is that disasters can very often usher us through to a future. And of course, charitable giving and charities will be at the front of that future, and they will pick up on all the things that that future needs. They will also, very worryingly, perhaps that's the grand plan, end up filling a space for all the things we know make life worth living, but won't be there anymore. Arts, culture, libraries, swimming, sport, animal welfare, more sport, being outside. We've seen an incredible growth in membership of things like the national parks, the Royal Society for Protection of Birds, charities related to the stewardship of nature and climate adaptation. We also have to safeguard our future, and any of you involved with charities working around children and young people, you have to start making choices in disaster. That is something the UK has been incredibly bad at, and we are simply not having disaster triage conversations. Which people win? It's a very uncomfortable discussion, but certainly the role of children and young people in the rebuild is really important. The other thing that we've seen in the pandemic is a growth in allyship in the charitable sector. I'm seeing in my own work much more partnership. Sometimes I'm seeing established charities working with newer charities, perhaps very, very grassroots, working with a more established partnership. And sometimes there's what I would describe as tough love in that relationship. Often community-activated grassroots charities formed after disaster don't have a governance structure. That often they'll start off as perhaps a CIC and then become a charity. And what we're seeing is some interesting allyship around mentoring between more established organisations, and of course the association is at the heart of that. Charities asking themselves difficult questions about whether they're propping up existing inequalities. We're seeing in my own work, and I work a lot with what's called the health partners, charities who provide support after the Grenfell disaster in 2017. And they are constantly wrestling with challenges around faith and cultural considerations. And I've literally just tweeted the link, it's very fresh and very new, to the Royal College of General Practitioners accreditation that the local health partners working with the Integrated Care Board have received accreditation for their cultural competency work. And that has direct relevance on the local charities because a lot of what we offer post-disaster is around social prescribing. So the other types of partnerships we are seeing is between particularly health agencies and charities. I've been really privileged, as I say, to watch this work, and often, as has been said, what the charities don't necessarily need is money. They need support with governance, support with audit, and also support with particular training needs. I was asked in preparing for this to think a lot about what courageous leadership means to me. And I talk a lot in my work about being the Cassandras in risk management, the super forecasters, the people who say, I think we could be on a really difficult path there. And several of my podcasts have been about what that actually really means to be the only person speaking out against something. So really, really challenging in a room, difficult things, and literally grounding yourself physically for what will come, safeguarding. Some of these moments can, and trust me, do become career-ending. So what does it really mean to stick to a position, to record and log that you are making that decision? Where are your allies? How are you managing your meetings? I often sit in the back of meetings for organisations, and they think that they're practicing allyship, but they really aren't. Everything in their behaviour is about shutting down other voices. So that's very, very interesting to me. You are going to have to be prepared as a courageous leader to persevere. The other thing that I think a lot of my colleagues would agree with in terms of our approach to being courageous in our field is not about asking people to be more exciting about their ideas, but to very carefully both speak about and create what we call the reasonable worst case scenario. And we had reasonable worst case scenarios for a lot of things. And a lot of them are starting to become not reasonable worst-case scenarios, they're starting to become now what we are seeing. And you and I both know, and disaster planners don't have big politics, they only have big principles. I troll all party leaders equally. But when we were trying to perhaps say in 2016, 2018, 2019, these are the challenges, you become this very cynical voice of doom. So, statements like, there are charities here who will, or foundations supporting charities here who will not exist. We cannot get you all through. What does good look like for this sector? Where are you buffering, and what your buffering is doing is meaning that society is not realizing what has fallen away. That's a really difficult question sometimes. Charities, quite rightly, from a moral and ethical point of view, filling a gap, as we have seen for years, which has meant that ultimately the public do not believe that they will be allowed to fall and fail. And I don't believe that that is true anymore. And as I say, one of my areas of work is death planning. And one of those areas of work is making sure that the coronial process is streamlined so that we can collect the bodies from people's front rooms when they die of hunger and cold seamlessly so that the neighbours don't notice. So one of the things here is about what are we also shouting out about? The hardest thing to do in disaster is to pull out of something and say, we can't be the finger in the dam anymore. I continue in this very chirpy tone to tell you what the disaster literature tells us about the next few years. People will be iller, sicker, more addicted, more suicidal. We will see more sexual health issues, more public health issues, more environmental issues, and more death. So if you work in charities that are in any way connected to any of those things, you will expect your workload to change and increase. Simultaneously, those of you working the cheerier stuff around stewarding nature and children and all those other things I said, you can expect your work to increase. We will talk, no doubt the workshops will be a big theme. Will people have less to give, or will the giving change? Will we start looking to our left and our right and thinking, I'm not going to let my neighbours starve. I haven't got any spare cash this week, but I'm making a bigger casserole. How will help change? What I just said to you there was quite shocking, but that's how disaster planners talk. We get ready. If you are a charitable foundation supporting something wonderful like Men in Sheds is not a nice thing to do. It's an essential service. What the disaster literature shows us is that men, at about a 4 to 5 year point post-disaster, have a particular psychological dip. There are certain charities that we have been seeing as lovely, nice things that will become the difference in saving people's lives. Courageous leadership is also recognizing what is bad help. As I say, fulfilling a need that's not yours, fulfilling a need that is well catered for. We often, for example, have just giving schemes set up immediately for a household who've lost everything, and that household may well be insured. So I often find the insurers are like, yeah, nice one, set up a local just giving. We have situations at the moment where families never even make the call. Of course, we also have situations at the moment where we have communities where there is under 13% contents insurance cover. So that means we have to be nuanced. We have to be able to do both. But be aware that you may be fulfilling a need that is already financially covered. I get a lot of grief if I do challenge that something might be bad help. I took a lot of flack for a hashtag earlier this year, Cash Not Stuff, which was a plea for people to stop bluntly donating their crap. When we have either UK-based incidents, or in that particular case, I kicked it off around the Ukrainian war. And so one of the biggest secondary disasters that we see in UK disaster is the donation of people's soiled clothes, people's scuba gear, thank you, people's scuba gear, people's pans still with food burnt in. And I expected the threads to stay quite light-hearted, and what really broke my heart was when Grenfell survivors came in on that thread and said, can you imagine what it's like when we are already feeling completely unseen by other communities and completely let down by the state, and you drop us off socks and underwear that wasn't even clean? So, and also, unless there is a deliberate request or a deliberate shortage, it is very rare that we can't buy these things. I do now have people running stuff by me that it's okay. So, for example, I think there's lots of hospitals ask people to basically return, it's not really donate, crutches and things like that. That's understandable. But generally, it's money that organisations need in times of crisis. So that brings me, let's cheer this up a bit, that brings me to a case study that's been a real privilege this year to work with, the National Emergencies Trust, which launches appeals to raise funds and offers people one trusted place to give. And they work with charities and groups to share out the funds fast and fairly. They were set up within, I think probably history will show, just end of 2018-2019 discussions were happening. And by the time of the pandemic, they were just about ready to go, although I know their representatives here will say it took an awful lot of work. They were essential in the pandemic. They were a scaffold during people's honeymoon period where they want to do something, they want to give. It was organised. They've transformed. One of the things, I've always got my eyes and ears on what's going on in Whitehall, and they've transformed how state giving is seen in disaster. They've also fundamentally answered a question that was always coming at me, very much linked to the idea that the UK doesn't have disasters. So, there would be no need for something like a Disasters Emergencies Committee here because the UK would always sort it out. And they have become the trusted source of not just disaster response, but the best action in disaster is preparedness. It's collaboration and partnership in advance. And it is no small thing to say it's transformed the way that local authorities and others are thinking about corralling, scaffolding, supporting that human need to give in the aftermath of disaster. And we're seeing it big, as we saw with the pandemic, millions donated, and we're also seeing it on a slightly smaller scale. The National Emergencies Trust worked with local councils immediately after the wildfires that we saw in the summer to make sure that the messaging was, again, not to leave donations and to help them to both manage funds coming in and distribute those. So that was absolutely wonderful to see. The other personal thing that I love about the National Emergencies Trust is they're really good to me on a phone call. Which sounds strange, but lots of people just can't handle all of this. And they're like, no, you're scaring us, stop with the scaring. National Emergencies Trust were like, hit me more. Tell me the disaster pitfalls, be the wild card, tell me where we are going wrong. And that's a really interesting question that you'll see in the recovery guidance that I've given you, the Red Cross recovery guidance. Every organisation needs wild cards. And there's actually a card you can print off and cut out and the person holds it so that they're all safe. I'm union approved. But the other thing is external wildcards. Who are you bringing in? And I will always remember those early phone calls in the pandemic with the National Emergencies Trust because they were listening, they were brave. Me saying dark stuff wasn't going to offend them. Because the real challenge sometimes, and the most courageous I've ever been, is to say something is too much. There's the wrong thing being offered. There's a different way of doing it. There's a different type of help that could be accepted. And what was interesting in the early stages of the pandemic is that the calls coming into me, we had lots of corporations, military, some, although not all government departments, international governments, and then the local charities at Grenfell who had seen what happened before said, give us some more of that wildcard stuff. We listened to you 2018, 2019, tell us again about the pandemic. We know all about the honeymoon phase in this community. So we know about that. We know about the recovery graph. Tell us what comes next. So often the charities that were coming to me in the pandemic were very, very disaster savvy because they had walked that path before. So where does that leave us in 2032? We'll have weathered some great storms. I have a lot of hope for the future. We will have hopefully seen off the risk of vulnerability to abandonment of your communities, which is when charities overreach on their offer. They step out of what they're good at. They do too much, or they don't challenge the state, or often it is, as I say, things like the insurance sector, to pick up what they are supposed to pick up. We'll have a lot of stories to tell in 10 years' time. We will be very clear, I think, because of what we've been through in the next few months and years on our offer. The association will be even more important than ever, and will have had disaster learning at its heart and partnership in its soul. We will have climate adaptation much more built into what we do, just because all of our charities will be dealing with it. I can't quite predict where we will be with social media, but we will certainly have to establish over the next few years where our trusted sources of info are, because we've completely lost that. And my biggest hope of all is that we have communities at the heart, as we have always done. So going back into your office tomorrow, what does a disaster mean for your organisation? Many charities bristle when they're asked for their business continuity plans. Those are the really selfish, self-focused plans, which are how do you keep going? I'm not going to make you put up your hand, that would be mean, but I'm wondering how many of you have a power outage plan for your organisation. I wonder how many of you have enough insurance, both as an organisation and as a householder. On average, 80% of us are underinsured for contents insurance. When you finish thinking all negative, it's time to be positive again and think about the way that your charity will get involved when disasters happen. So I had a brilliant meeting, follow my Friday thread to see me in a brilliant meeting with infant feeding organisations in the UK, who again have really struggled with the idea that there's infant feeding in disaster, but in England we'll just sort infant feeding out, that's fine. And we had this brilliant meeting where they realised that yes, there were risks and concerns about the future, but also emergencies present them with opportunities. They had the research that showed that in the UK, in several of our recent incidents, breastfeeding had been significantly disrupted by the actions of UK emergency responders. We put the emergency responders and the baby feeding charities in a room together, and we basically wrote a plan. And by Saturday, we had it written down as a document. We had, like today, we had a minister who led in the room as well. This is how change happens. Disasters get you thinking. Go back now and exercise with your board, with your organisation, what you would do for certain scenarios. Come back to us for any advice that we can give and form a tactical advice cell, which is a very militaristic emergency planning way for saying a reading group. And that would be that you've got your eyes and ears on what's going on. In the meeting on Friday, none of the organisations in the room, completely understandably, had any knowledge of their community risk register, which is their local list of risks that could affect them. And that's important to me because we also have a national risk register. And at the top of the national risk register, for the last 16 years, as the most likely and severe national risk is a pandemic. And the most likely and severe risk for next year is a pandemic. Not this one, another one. We haven't changed that. So one of the things that I would say to you is that tactical advice cell is also got to be horizon scanning what's going on in the world. It is time to think really tough. Volunteers, staff are your workforce, they are your beating heart. Their industrial relations are just the same as any other organisation that we are seeing walk out on strike today, and I cannot tell you how worried the emergency planners are about the Jaffa Cake situation. And one of the things that you really need to worry about now is your industrial relations, essentially, which again is a kind of anathema sometimes in the charitable sector. But it's really hard to work for a charity when you are the people who are also needing help. The morale drop that we have seen in hospitals and police stations and local authority buildings once we put food banks in. The compassion fatigue at that point. The sniping that the people we are helping have more than we do. So this is really important to think about your own organisation at this point and to think about things like your own financial governance. We see a lot greater theft at this point. Your own issues around stigma, who you're choosing to help, and how to say no when the need is so great. If I can plug, particularly to any foundations looking to invest, in the wonderful Latimer Community Art Therapy. A charity, it's a CIC that's going for charitable status at the base of the Grenfell Tower that was formed within 48 hours of the fire, initially as a place of refuge and rest for children. But several of the local residents are trained art psychotherapists, and they have now been going for 5 years. They're one of the biggest art psychotherapy providers in the area, but they also, as all of us who work with children and young people know, that you can't just do the therapy on its own. They provide a youth club, breakfast, lunch, tea, a safe place in the evenings. And that was where I found my hope in the very, very dark days after the summer of 2017. So go back to your organisation now and use the D word. Use the resources to stimulate discussion. At the heart of all of this work is you and the incredible bricolage, the French word for odd jobs that you do, the networking, giving up time to come today. And thank you for what you do. It is needed more than ever.